Okay, apologies for my late start this morning. We had a number of logistics issues that had to be figured out, and not very good support. So this morning we're going to be continuing on our discussion of aspects of study design, and then going on to discussion of components of study operation. This will include a discussion of human ethics concerns, use of the smartphone as a stream aggregator to combine together data from multiple wearables and other devices, and discussion of some of the challenges that come up on an ongoing basis throughout a deployment, including things such as monitoring adherence by participants, some of the barriers to continued adherence, and we'll start to get into a little bit of the infrastructure needed to monitor said adherence and to examine some of the incoming data in the closing components. As yesterday, I thought it was quite successful in terms of using a bunch of the day for project work, and I appreciate the various project teams for their work on the 3 projects currently articulated. Today we're going to also spend the bulk of the afternoon pursuing these project ideas. And I'll be working with you, as will Mohammed, and our co-lead Kevin Stanley, who has arrived today, and who will be adding his perspective and insights to a lot of the discussions, and where needed may contribute presentations. So Kevin is the co-lead with me, and has been for the better part of a decade, of the IEPI project, out of which Ethica Health was spun a couple years back, and will be a really important contributor to this camp. Now, before launching into the day, I'd like to begin, as I normally do, with a retrospective over what we saw yesterday. Yesterday we talked about a couple conceptual issues and also engaged in some hands-on experience with the Ethica Health system. We began with a discussion of some of the study goals and talked about the interaction between the goals, otherwise which might seem like solitudes, of using smartphones and wearables as means of data collection purely, versus using them as means for intervening, for achieving attempts to shift health behaviors, health exposures, etc. That was a theme we talked on briefly to delineate those important, distinct but somewhat overlapping areas of the mHealth literature. We also talked about the staging, the progressive phases associated with studies, and this involved some discussion of the initial contact with participants, recruitment strategies, some of the engagement of the patient in ongoing data collection and different routes of exit. We approach that from the perspective of a single participant. Today we're going to be stepping back and talking about the broader elements of study planning and study operation that reflect the study as a whole and its progress through its own set of phases. We also talked some about recruitment strategies in a little bit more detail, noting the wide variety of strategies possible, from on the one hand classic recruitment through postering and advertisements, to strategies which leverage social media, such as Facebook, Craigslist, etc., which we've used in other studies to good effect. We started to also touch on some of the ways in which study design ends up influencing recruitment, specifically, for example, through having, if you're trying to recruit networks, there are some impacts and some constraints that can come from that in the form of recruitment of individuals. And it can complicate the timing of data collection from individuals if you first have to recruit the networks in which they are part. And it can impair their continued operation in the study if some of those network members depart the study partway. We'll come back to some of those issues today in discussion of retention and study operation. The latter part of yesterday's morning, though, was spent looking at the ways in which the Ethica Health system is one particular system for performing data collection using smartphones and wearables across both major smartphone platforms, supports questionnaires. By extension, it was further a discussion of how it supports user-triggered actions associated with the buttons that you see in your user interface. So if you go to Ethica Health, any of those studies in which you enrolled on the first day, you will find that each of them is associated with buttons specific to it, and those buttons operate by calling up questionnaires. And we saw the building blocks of those questionnaires yesterday using a graphical user interface that makes them fairly easy to compose. And Mohammed led us through an exercise in which you built up a questionnaire graphically through this interface. And we saw that the building blocks were fairly rich. It included classic question types such as multiple choice and multi-select, things where you have checkboxes. But it also included multimedia content such as photos and images, and further also offered things such as visual analog scales and the capacity to scan barcodes, which is a little bit unusual. Beyond a number of added question types, for example, types that know about the unit for weight or the unit for length, and that recognize numbers explicitly. And collectively, these types allow for a fairly rich experience, particularly when coupled with the fact that the system allows you to specify skip patterns and allows for variable substitution. Substitution of information as gleaned from responses to other questions in the same survey or in different survey instruments. So, for example, someone could enter an other selection for something by typing a bit of text, and then that might be used in another question to inquire more about that particular item. We saw that the resulting questionnaires could exhibit, as one might expect, nonlinear flow, so you can have branching constructs. And while it may require question duplication in some cases because of the constraints, it tends to be a very powerful system for composing questions. Okay, questionnaires for participants. Now, one thing we didn't really touch on, but which bears a bit of emphasis today, is the fact that the appearance of those questions, and indeed the appearance of the buttons, will be a little bit different for different devices. Okay, the variations are more pronounced in the Android world because of the diversity of form factors. Mohammed had noted that Ethica has been used at this point on something like 120 different devices. And those devices span a wide variety of shapes and sizes, what we call form factors. And some of them might be tablets like this one, others might be cell phones such as this. There are smaller cell phones yet, but some of you have used the S3 minis. Then there's these larger phablets that sort of span between these smaller tablets and phones, and larger and smaller items in there. And one thing to bear in mind is when you are creating questionnaires using the system, it bears testing them on different devices. And Mohammed actually showed an interface at one point where he was rendering what the screen would look like that was designed on different devices. And you may find the participant experience is a little bit different. A notable feature of that is for the question types that support free-form text entry, and those would include free-form text, but also the one that chooses between free-form text and audio. Be aware that in some of the smaller devices, the keyboard actually takes up a large fraction of the screen. And when you're dealing with the placement of questions on a page, it again bears testing the questionnaire at least on extremes of devices, so you can get a sense of the aesthetics and even the usability, the ability to fill out it adequately on smaller devices. We've had some issues with that with the S3 minis that we had to work through. Mohammed, could you comment on, do you remember those issues we ran into with the S3 minis with the keyboard occluding some of the yet next and previous buttons? That still sometimes required the keyboard to be retracted, is that correct?
Let me just,
or has that been changed now?
That has been changed.
It has been, okay. Okay. But this just brings home the point that when testing your system, don't assume that it's done when you get that survey definition in place. Bear in mind that the look and feel may be very different in different cases. And the same thing with the splash screen that's used as the background image. I guess it's not a splash screen, but it's a background image for the individual studies. Be aware that it may look rather different on a smaller device than a large one. And you want to check your systems for their kind of look and feel for this, particularly as you're designing what goes on in a given page. Okay, so those were some components that we didn't really dwell on yesterday, but are worth bearing in mind. Okay, I did want to emphasize that at one point Mohammed showed you how you could lend a title to a questionnaire. I believe he mentioned in passing that title would be what is used in the button that can trigger that questionnaire. So if you're seeking to place buttons for user-triggered questionnaires, you're going to really want to pay attention to that title, how long it is, how big it is, to affect the shape and size of that button. And the ease of sort of understanding what it is at a glance, okay? It also bears note that the interface you saw yesterday was just one of several that are relevant to composing questionnaires. Mohammed had noted, again, somewhat as an aside, that there's, coming out of that process, it composes an encoding for these surveys called a JSON file. Okay, and JSON is a way of characterizing structured data that's very common on the web, and you can actually download the JSON files for your surveys. If you have people on your team who are technical in the computer area, sometimes editing the JSON file directly will afford some benefits vis-a-vis using the graphical system. Best to use the graphical system if possible, if it's straightforward, but there are times where you want to just duplicate and tweak a bunch of questions or what have you, where recourse to the JSON may be of use. Or if you want to go through and bulk replace one word by another, doing so in this text file may be a lot quicker. Okay, so be aware that it's there. Be aware that there are special editors for it. Mohammed showed one online that will render it in a pretty way. It'll prettify it, as we sometimes say, and allow you to edit it there. And finally, Mohammed was noting that I guess there's that soon there will be a new online questionnaire editor, supported by the system, which I thought the one that was there right away, right now, was pretty good, but he tells me the new one is even better. Is that fair to say?
Sure, yes.
And it's in the oven right now, and will be emerging baked later. Okay?
Correct, yes.
Okay. Great. So that was a little bit about composing questionnaires and so on. Now, the afternoon, as we said, we spent that time working on studies and so on, and I was pretty pleased with how that was going. I would particularly highlight the need to identify as early as possible when you're defining a study some of the contextual triggering needs, because there's a longer lead time, a longer time needed to put those into place. Mohammed showed two basic mechanisms that can be used to trigger questionnaires during his run-through. One mechanism was a mechanism that you can actually encode textually. And this would be for more common types of conditions. A separate mechanism is one that requires some more in-depth computer technical expertise in the form of coding and languages such as Java. And both of these have possibilities. If you can identify as early as possible what the triggering conditions are for surveys, it can allow discussion as to which technique is best, and if it requires coding and Java or compatible language, Java JVM compatible language, then the time for that can be longer if you identify the need early. And if any of the projects in the room are in need of that, I would highlight the availability of a certain amount of Java expertise on the part of TAs here, okay? So several people here have significant experience in Java, and I'd like them to try to step up today and consider whether they could put in place some triggering mechanisms based on the exemplar code that Mohammed presented yesterday, where he highlighted some example code. And I'm sure that he'd be able to give you pointers. It's best to get this experience here when there's hand-holding to be done rather than when Mohammed is far away. All right? Okay. So it'll be good for today's projects to see if we could use the time to get going on some contextual triggering needs, and to further the survey instrument creation that was undertaken yesterday. I would also note the desirability to get interfaces in front of people. I teach software engineering, and one of the principles that we teach in software engineering, also for that matter in dynamic modeling, is to proceed in a very iterative, incremental style. Get it in front of people and get their feedback to best lead it on to a successful conclusion. So even if you have a more sophisticated system in mind down the road, showing to people early on what you've got can allow for them to guide you much more effectively. People have a hard time imagining in their heads what an interface will look like, and often it takes putting it in front of them to really elicit strong guidance on how to proceed with it. So in short, produce it early, produce it often, and try to get feedback. We saw that with one of the teams yesterday. One of the teams presented to me a very nice start on this work here for ground truth recording, and I took a look at it, and seeing it made me think, okay, we probably want to tweak this part, tweak that part. We want to change how this is presented, and I was able to give a bit of feedback. And I'd say for the other teams too, just getting something in front of you, even if it's terribly incomplete, even if it only has one of 6 survey instruments you're intending to put in there, getting that in front of people sooner would be advised to make sure that you can get clarity on where to go next and how the instrument should look. And getting that over time can refine your plans for later instruments. Okay? So those are some comments on the experience from yesterday. I liked the energy in the room during the projects session, and we'll try to keep that going today. I'm grateful to all the TAs for their work with the project teams for driving the projects forward. Very happy to see how things were going tomorrow. And Kevin and myself and Mohammed will try to circulate among the teams today to provide some additional guidance, okay? Okay, any questions coming out of yesterday before we jump into discussion of some additional elements of study design and then go on to aspects of ethics and operation, study operation? Any questions? Comments? Mohammed, do you want to make any utterances? Okay. Very good. Maybe one of the TAs could check when Amin and Aiden want to give their little demo on the wearables, okay? Oh, there's Amin back there, okay. In the afternoon? Okay, we'll aim at that then. Thank you very much.